Tonight, we're very fortunate to have with us Dan Jackson, and he's coming to us all the way from La Crosse on this lovely May day. He's a naturalist and past president and current treasurer of both the Wisconsin Dragonfly Society and the Coulee Region Audubon Society. Dan participates in a variety of research activities and citizen science projects and continues to lead field trips in search of dragonflies, damselflies, and birds. He's also a published wildlife photographer, having been published in many publications, including the Wisconsin Natural Resources Magazine, the Big River Magazine, Dragonflies of Wisconsin, and the Badger Birder. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dan.
Thank you, everybody. Basically, what I'm here tonight is to talk about damsels and dragons, which basically means we're talking about the insect order Odonata. And the word Odonata means, I got myself flustered. I do this, you just have to put up with it. The toothed ones. And basically, it's referring to the fact that these guys are some of the most ferocious predators in the natural world for their size. And that includes both as flying adults, and what you're seeing here is a dragon hunter dragonfly that has taken a ruby-throated hummingbird to the ground and is trying to kill it.
Oh my God. You don't like that.
I believe the story says the guy interrupted this and what's going on? Oh, okay.
We're having a few technology issues. This is Susan Schuler, she's the vice president, and she's running the Zoom meeting from her laptop in the other room. But we ran into some problems that we didn't run into in April.
You're okay with transcription? Someone has requested transcription for the
Can we
Zoom.
move it down a little bit?
I'm not sure you can change anything with it.
That's better.
For us.
Yeah,
I don't know if that'll work.
she can move it herself.
Okay. Is that location okay?
Sure.
10 times the
Okay.
biomass.
Sorry about that.
No problem. So yeah, so they're some of the most ferocious predators in the natural world, both as flying adults and as nymphs. And they spend the majority of their life as nymphs under the water, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But here you have this is a darner nymph that has caught and is killing and will consume a minnow, basically the same size as it is. So they're amazing predators. Thought we'd start though by talking about a little bit what is the difference between a damselfly and dragonfly. And basically the answer is they're cousins. Damselflies up here are members of the suborder Zygoptera, which means like-sized or like-shaped wings. And the majority of them, when they're mature, perch like this with their wings over their back. And when they do that, you can see that all four wings basically line up almost exactly. Dragonflies, on the other hand, are members of the suborder Anisoptera, which means different sized and different shaped wings. And you can see with this widow skimmer what they're talking about. The lead pair of wings are long and narrow, and then the rear ones are basically the same length, but nearly twice as wide. Another big difference related to those wings is that the wing surface of the dragonfly is way bigger proportionally compared to the size of their body than the wing surface of the damselfly. That means two things. One, they need a bigger, more robust body to power those wings. So you can see that where the damselfly is relatively fragile and delicate looking, the dragonfly is much more chunky, robust, muscular looking. But it also means that they have quite different flying capabilities. A dragonfly is a super fast flyer, very agile. They can fly at speeds up to 30 miles an hour. They can literally stop on a dime. They can hover. They can even back up a little bit. And basically they are purely aerial predators. All they do is chase down other flying insects or other flying prey. I guess it could be hummingbirds. Damselflies, on the other hand, basically have a top flight speed of more like 4 or 5 miles an hour. And what they do then, instead of, although they'll try to catch other flying insects, they aren't as capable. So what you'll often see them doing is flying in the weeds, right down in the vegetation, and they'll fly up to a plant and pluck their prey, right? So they're gleaners. They'll grab aphids and things right off of the leaves and things like that. So big difference between these, how they hold their wings over the back, spread wide or even a little bit downwards for a dragonfly. Very much more delicate here, much more robust. And then another thing to notice is the head configuration, and it's better seen over here. A damselfly has a head that basically runs perpendicular to the main axis of the body, and then it has widely separated eyes that are way out on the tip of those stalks. So it's kind of like a miniature hammerhead shark, if you want to think of it that way. Dragonflies, on the other hand, and it doesn't show it really well, but have a much more rounded helmet-shaped head. And with the exception of one family in Wisconsin, all of them have eyes that either touch or share a seam right down the center of their face. Oops, this is going to be a little confusing. Anatomy-wise, as I said before, we're talking about insects. So the flying adults have 3 basic body parts, which would be the head, the thorax, and the abdomen. The primary features of the head, the noticeable features of the head are, one, it doesn't have huge antennae. As a purist, I get really frustrated when people take artistic liberty and have, dragonfly art that shows these crazy big antennas, because they have antennae, but they're very underdeveloped, and that's because they're primarily sight predators. Instead, they have extremely complicated and well-developed eyes. There are some dragonfly families where their compound eyes literally have 30,000 different lenses in there. And where we have 3 different types of color receptors in our eyes, they can have up to 12 to 13. So they're seeing ultraviolet light and basically other wavelengths of light that we probably can't even understand. Another thing that they do have is huge mouth parts. Like I said, these guys are predators, and their main prey are other insects. And so they have to, and insects have hard exoskeletons. So these guys have pretty fabulous mouth parts that can literally chomp an insect into bits, grind it up, and swallow it. In the center, we've got the thorax. I like to think of that as the power center. Basically, that's where the 2 pairs of wings and the 3 pairs of legs are attached. And it's filled with muscles, especially to drive those wings. One thing to notice is that the legs are each pair of legs is different than the others, with the 4 legs being the shortest, and then middle legs being middle length, and the hind ones being much longer. And in some cases, that's really, really pronounced. Basically, what that means is that these guys are not designed to walk. So they don't use their legs for locomotion. They don't move with their legs. They don't walk. They may make slight adjustments, but you're never going to see them just kind of walking across a surface. If they need to change direction, usually what they'll do is they'll get up, fly, turn, and set back down. Instead, those legs are designed basically to catch their prey. And it doesn't show it here, but they have huge spines that stick out that help them grab their prey as they capture it. Finally, we have the abdomen, and it's basically divided into 10 segments. We typically start from the back, with this being number 10, and go forward. Those segments have soft segment connections that allow the abdomen to flex and to curl, and that will be very important in a little bit as we see that how they mate, because they actually curl that abdomen pretty significantly. A couple of the most important things to notice here: under segment 2, if it's a male, there are secondary genitalia there that would be used to pass a packet of sperm to the female during the mating process. And they also have what we call the anal appendages or terminal appendages at the back end. And in the case of a male, there are two cerci on the top and an epiproct or a paraproct underneath. And they're used to grab the female either by the back of the head in a dragonfly, or by basically the neck, if you want to consider it that, for a damselfly. In a female, they only have two, the top, the cerci, because she doesn't need to grab, she doesn't need that to grab. Those can come in really handy to me as a surveyor of dragonflies, because there are some dragonflies and damselflies that are very difficult to identify just by looking at them. But these are actually unique for each species. Basically, they're designed like a lock and key so that a male of one species can only basically grab and hold the female of that same species. They have notches and different structures that fit very specifically into notches on the female's head, and that helps prevent hybridization. So even with super closely related species, those are unique. If you, and in worst case, in that case, you might have to catch them, look at those under a loop to figure out which species you have. Like I said, I'm going to get real confused because I'm driving with two devices, and I'm Norwegian, so I have a hard enough time driving as it is. Next, I'd like to talk about the life cycle of Odonata. As you can see here, Odonata have a three-part life cycle, and a lot of us are very familiar with butterflies and beetles and the four-part life cycle, for instance, of a monarch butterfly, where they have an egg, a caterpillar, a pupa, and then the flying adult. And they go through an absolute complete metamorphosis in that pupal stage, where basically the whole organism basically turns into a soup and reorganizes itself completely. That's not the case here with dragonflies and damselflies. They're a little more prehistoric, a little more simple creatures. So they actually do that metamorphosis right within their nymphal skin and do a partial metamorphosis to become a flying adult. The eggs are either laid right in the water or adjacent to it or above it, because the nymphs will actually develop in the water. So sometimes they're laid in plant material, sometimes they're just dropped on the surface of the water and let sink. Sometimes they're deposited in the mud on the edge of a stream or on the bank, right? So a flood will rise and then they can hatch. Sometimes they're inserted in plant stems above the water that will then fall into the water over the course of a winter. Some of those eggs hatch immediately. Right now, if you've been out and about in the last month, you've probably seen a few dragonflies. Those are migrants. They just came up here all the way from the Gulf Coast. There's probably 10 or 15 species of dragonflies and damselflies that migrate into the state. Typically, when they lay an egg, they're going to hatch almost immediately, probably within a week. And then the larvae will develop over the course of the summer, and then they'll emerge and fly back. So that's a very fast turnaround. Other ones that have may lay their eggs in late summer, and then those eggs will stay dormant until spring, and then their development process will start, and they'll fly, and those will emerge and fly in the late summer. So it just depends on the species. What you're seeing here is a female prince basket-tail. And if you look, there's this ball down at the tip of her abdomen. What she's doing right now is she's sitting there extruding a really long string of eggs. And once that's extruded, she'll fly out and tap that on the surface of the water. It will unfurl and it'll be a huge line of eggs. Individual females can lay literally anywhere between hundreds and a couple thousand eggs during the course of their lifetime. The next stage is the nymph. When that egg hatches, if you will, a prolarva comes out, it immediately sheds its skin and actually becomes a true nymph, a dragonfly nymph. The the nymph, its habitat requirements are going to really determine where you find any specific species. And those habitat requirements can be super, super specific or very general. So we have some species where you could walk up to any pond, any stream, whatever, and you'll find that species there. There are other ones that are like a Heinz emerald is a federally endangered species. It literally has to be in a place that has a hard limestone layer underneath it. A specific species of crayfish has to exist so that it can coexist in their burrows to overwinter, and it takes them 3 years to develop. So it's the nymph's habitat requirement that will determine where you're going to find the adults actually laying the eggs. The nymph is the longest part of the life cycle. Like I said, I gave you some examples where that was pretty short, only a few months, those migrants. But there are also cases where it can take years. The longest documented nymph lifespan that I've heard about is 8 years, and that's for a dragon hunter, and specifically populations that are farther north in the taiga, where the water, where water is really cold. It takes them, they just can't develop very fast. So their life cycle as a nymph can take much, much longer. We have quite a few species here in Wisconsin that take 2 and 3, at least 3 years. Just like I talked a little bit about how when the egg is laid, when the prolarva comes out, it molts its skin. Well, at that point, it's basically the size of a pinhead. And in most cases, they may grow. I've got some examples of a couple over here that are about like that big. So in order to grow that far, they have to, they have to eat a lot, grow, but then they have a hard exoskeleton, just like an adult insect. So what they then have to do is molt their skin so that they can go on to another stage where they're a little bit bigger. We call that an instar, between that time between each of those molts. And it usually takes 12 to 13 molts or instars before a nymph goes from the egg to the final instar that is ready to emerge as a flying adult. Just like the flying adult, the nymphs of damselflies and the nymphs of dragonflies look quite different. This is a damselfly nymph, and you can already see that it's a much more frail and delicate little guy. You also know, if you notice, it's got 3 external gills back here. So this is, and what you can start to see, this one is getting ready to emerge. You can kind of see the wing pads that are developing there. It's actually developing and already starting that metamorphosis process to get ready to be a flying adult. The dragonfly, on the other hand, is already much more robust. And if you notice, one of the big differences, it doesn't have any external gills. Instead of its gills are actually inside of its abdomen. So it sucks water in and out of its rectum and absorbs oxygen through gill structures inside, but it gives it another really interesting capability that its cousin, the damselfly nymph, doesn't have. And that is, it can actually use that water that it sucked in and squirt it out and basically use it as jet propulsion. So it can squirt so hard. If you put a darner nymph in a pan that's only 1 inch deep, and if you scare it, the water will actually shoot out of it. It'll break the surface tension. And it's that strong. And they just, so they can use that to get away from predators, but they can also use that to chase prey. So this is a darner nymph. Like I said, the nymphs can take anywhere from 3 to 4 months to 8 years to go through that full development. When they get into that final instar, they actually go through the final metamorphosis right within their nymphal skin to turn into a flying adult. And when and how they emerge then is also really variable. We're just starting into the very beginning of the emergence season for a lot of species, and there are a significant number of species who use weather and water temperature as their clue to do a mass emergence. So they've gone through the winter in that final instar ready to emerge. And basically the clues of daylight and accumulated warmth of the temperature of the water is going to be the final clue to basically get the whole population to emerge at once. So you may go to a pond and see absolutely nothing going on one day, and then the next day, and there's just clouds of these brand new dragonflies or damselflies that are emerging. When that time comes, what you'll see is the dragonfly needs to at least get partially out of the water, or damselfly needs to get partially out. In this case, this is a 12-spotted skimmer nymph, and he's crawled out of the water. This was about 2 feet away from the edge of a pond, and he's crawled out onto a large leaf, and then he just grabs hold and really tightly. And at that point, he or she will start the process of emergence. And the first thing you'll do is you'll see them kind of swell a little bit, and then you'll see their skin is going to start to split. I always compare this to the Hulk. You know, basically he just starts growing and he splits open, but instead of splitting his shirt, he literally splits the nymphal skin on his back. And it actually splits from about the base of this wing pad up into the head. And now here you can already start to see that split. The nymph is starting to emerge. Part of it is coming out. You can see the colors of its eyes. And then it basically splits it enough and it just starts pushing its body out. And in the case of many species, it will push itself to the point where only its abdomen is still attached, and it's got its legs and the rest of its body out. And what you'll see at that point is it'll just sit there and just wait. And what it's doing is it's letting its legs, the exoskeleton of its legs, harden enough to support its weight. So it needs that structural stability of its legs to support its weight before it can go on to the next step. So here you can see it doing that. It's just basically waiting for those legs to harden. And from here to here, from this first one to the second one is literally like a second. Basically, it reached up, grabbed hold of the legs and popped its abdomen out. So at that point, it has emerged. And at this point, what it needs to do is effectively blow itself up because it's been all scrunched in that nymphal skin. And now it needs to assume its full, mature flying adult form. The first thing it will do is it will start pumping hemoglyph into its wings and extend those wings. And once the wings are fully extended, then it will start pumping using air pressure and blood pressure again to basically blow out its abdomen and fully it extends its abdomen. Kind of like those circus clowns with the little balloons that turn into, little dogs or whatever. Basically the same thing. That just, it's all scrunched up and it just extends out to its full length, and then that's it. And at that point, it'll basically then just sit there for 10, 15, 20 minutes until its exoskeleton is hard enough to support flight. And then it's going to take a flight and get the heck out of there, get away from the water. Here is at this stage, we call this a teneral. So this is fully, the wings are fully extended. This is a damselfly. Its wings are fully extended. It hasn't completed the extension of its abdomen. Its abdomen will be about another third longer when it's fully done. You can tell when a major emergence event has happened, because if you go to a pond, you'll find lots of these basically empty nymphal skins. We call them exuvi or exuvia. And basically those are left behind. And actually they are unique to species. So we can actually collect those and identify exactly which dragonflies or damselflies were able to be produced from that specific body of water. Emergence is a very dangerous time. I mean, it takes a super healthy individual to survive this event. And there's a lot of things that can go wrong. In this case, it looks like its jaw hung up in the nymphal skin. So he got part of the way, he or she got part of the way out, and that was it. And she didn't, it didn't make it. Sometimes the blood pressure or, that pumping of that hemoglyph into the wings, if something happens, and if there's a major failure. So in this case, it wasn't able to extend the wings. It got its abdomen fully extended, but not the wings. So that adult will never be able to fly. Here's another one where it didn't get the wings pads completely out of its nymphal skin. So again, it fully extended its abdomen, but it got hung up on its own nymphal skin, and it will never fly. So at this point, they're ready to take off. And when they do take off, they are going to want to leave the area. There is a tremendous amount of predation and competition and territorial fighting and stuff that goes on typically at the water's edge. So a young, soft dragonfly or damselfly is not going to want to stay there. And there's also not a lot of food. So what they typically do is take off and move out and get away from water, find an area where they can feed and become sexually mature before they come back to water. That first flight is really dangerous. Their exoskeleton is not very hard, so they aren't very accomplished flyers yet. They can fly pretty well. They still are pretty agile, but there's a lot of stuff out there that would like nothing better than to grab a big old squishy 10-year-old dragonfly or damselfly, and that includes basically maybe its own sister. This is a female Midland clubtail that caught a 10-year-old Midland clubtail on its very first flight. I felt really bad because I actually flushed that clubtail and I watched it fly, and then I watched this other one swoop in and so it happens. Like I said before, when they first emerge, everything is really soft. Their exoskeleton, it needed to be very soft and pliable to allow it to expand. And you can actually see that. You can see in this case how milky and shiny the wings are, and then also how softly colored the body is. This one literally just emerged within the last hour. It probably has taken its first flight just a few feet, but then it's waiting to take its next flight until it hardens up even that much more. One day later, it looks almost completely different. And that's because its exoskeleton has become fully dried and it's starting to achieve, really, really full colors. This one is immature, and I can tell that just because it's yellow and black and the eyes are pale. So this is probably a dragonfly that emerged within the last 2 or 3 days. When that male is ready to mate and head back to water, he is changed yet again. So with sexual maturity, this species actually changes color, and its eyes also change color. So a lot of dragonflies and damselflies go through some pretty major color changes as they get ready, as they become sexually mature and ready to head back to water. Another example, this is an immature widow skimmer. It's a pond species. Again, note how it isn't quite as obvious here, but note how milky looking the wings are, real shiny. This one's a little more colorful, probably wasn't taken quite as quickly compared to when it first emerged. Just a few days later, you're starting to see some color, some white color. What's happening there is a substance, a waxy substance is actually getting laid down. We call it prunicity. And the males of this species will develop that on the wing, on their wings to show that they are sexually mature. And here is that fully sexually mature male of that same species. So he has developed that prunos covering on his wings, but then also on the top of his abdomen. So they've now emerged, they've headed away. They've stayed away from water for anywhere from a week to several weeks. And once they become sexually mature, it's now time to mate. So typically what will happen is the males will head, with most of our species, the males will head back to water, set up territories, and then when the females are ready to mate, they will come and find the spot that they prefer, and then the male that has that territory will grab her and they will go through the mating process. And what happens is when the male sees her, what he'll do is fly and grab her from behind and then reach forward with the tip of his abdomen, like I talked about, and use that to grab her by the back of the head. And at that point, when we see dragonflies in this formation, we call that flying in tandem, where you've got where they're connected by those claspers. When the female is ready, basically she will reach forward with the tip of her abdomen and then connect to the secondary genitalia under segment 2 of the abdomen, and there'll be a packet of sperm that will be transferred to her to fertilize her eggs. And we typically call this being in the wheel, because it's kind of and in the case of damselflies, because they have much longer, proportionally longer abdomens, it almost looks like a heart shape. Once that sperm transfer has been completed, the female can now fertilize her eggs, so it's now time for her to lay her eggs. And even there, with 165 species of damselflies and dragonflies in the state, there's a tremendous variation of how that process happens. In this case, these are one species of migrant that we have. One of the ones that this is the most obvious to most. It's a common green darner. They've been arriving here for the last month. They are the only dragonfly where the pair will stay in tandem while she's actually ovipositing. And you can actually see what she's doing, that right here, this little black thing is an ovipositor. It's basically almost like a needle that she's using to puncture that plant material, and she is inserting her eggs right into that plant material, floating plant material. So what the male is doing here is he's protecting her and trying to keep other males from remating with her, basically trying to make sure that her offspring are his. A lot of damselflies doing something very similar. We call this contact guarding. The male stays connected, and again, the female in this case, she's inserting the eggs into the bark of that stick in the water. Just one more of the many, many, many different subtle differences. These are spreadwing damselflies. You can see they have their wings kind of spread out rather than over the top of their back. With many of those species, the female is inserting her eggs into this grass stem. And you can see all these little white dots. Those are the holes that she's drilled where she has inserted that egg. This is one of those species where the eggs don't hatch immediately. So what she's doing is by inserting it into live plant material in the fall and winter, those stems will drop into the water. And then in the spring, those eggs will be ready to hatch and then develop. Other ones simply tap. I showed you that picture of that basket tail that was extruding eggs before. Very similar process here. She's extruding eggs as she's flying, and then she flies down and just taps the tip of her abdomen, and basically the eggs are washing off and adhering to this mass of moss in the water. What you don't see here is that there's a male hovering right above her, right about there, trying to protect her from other males. And if another male sees her and starts coming in, he'll try to chase him away. This is, in that case, it's called hover garden. Any questions about life cycles and anatomy, and so on? Yeah.
So what time of spring, or is it the entire spring or summer that you see them emerging from the water?
It's pretty much throughout the whole year. Different species will emerge at different times. Like I talked about, there's a bunch of them that use weather as the key to, as the clue into, and they're going to be emerging right now over the next several weeks. So you'll see one day you'll go to a body of water, see nothing, and then the next time you go out there, you might see 1,000 basket tails. And those are those mass emergence that all emerge together based on water temperature. There are other species then that will emerge much later in the season, and it's usually over a longer period of time. A great example are what we call the Styluris genera of clubtails. I mean, they typically start to emerge late June, and they'll emerge all the way into September. So it really, and then the darners typically are the latter half of the year. A lot of the skimmers are the beginning of the year, so it's really species dependent. Yeah.
Dan, I'm really curious about those that fly as adults from the Gulf states or the Gulf here. Is it just one generation that does that, unlike monarchs that 3 or 4 to get?
It's the same with them. It's a great question. One generation is going to go north, and the next generation is going to go south. So there isn't a generation like monarchs that actually overwinter somewhere. Instead, the generation that is just arrived here in the last month probably emerged a month earlier in Georgia, Mississippi, wherever. And then they flew about 1,000 miles, and then they will find a mate here, lay eggs. Then they will die. When they're done laying their eggs, they're done. So then that next generation, those eggs will hatch within a week. The nymphs will develop over a 4-month period, and then they will emerge, fly back south, that same 1,000 miles, and then they will lay their eggs immediately. That generation dies, and then it takes the winter for the next. So it's one generation going one way, one going back. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was wondering, how long do these typically, the Wisconsin species, stay in the egg stage, and then how many days or weeks in the nymph stages, and how many instars are there in the nymphal stages?
Okay, eggs, this really varies species to species. Some of those eggs, like I said, will hatch within a week. Others are designed to go into a state of diapause, so they'll be laid, typically those are the ones laid in the fall, and then they'll overwinter as an egg and hatch in the spring. So you kind of got 2 classes. Let me see. The nymph development ranges anywhere. The really fast nymph development is about 3 months, 3 to 4 months. There are southern spreadwings in the state right now that just arrived. They're laying their eggs right now. And I typically see the tendrils of that species will be emerging in late June, early July. So actually as short as 8 weeks. 6 weeks. And again, there are many species where the nymph takes multiple years to develop. A lot of the clubtails, 2 to 3 years. That one clubtail I talked about, up to 8 years, depending on the environment. I
was wondering how many instars are there in the
12 or
nymphal?
13 is the typical number. It can vary a little bit, just depends on but 12 is pretty much the average.
Because in copepods, there are 6 naupliar and then 6 copepodite stages, and finally the adult. So is the adult shorter lived than the nymphal stages, are the primary time?
For most species, the flying adult will fly for less time than it was a nymph. There's some where it's pretty close, actually.
Thank you.
Okay. In that case, I'm going to just go on to show you some examples of these crazy critters. That crazy is a word of endearment, you have to understand. Here in Wisconsin, at this point, we know of 165 species that are found regularly. There were 2 other species of dragonflies that were reported one time each in 1908, and we're not sure if that's a historical record anomaly or if it really happened. Of those 165 species, 117 of those are dragonflies and 48 are damsels. Minnesota has a few less species, and the reason for that is they gain fewer species to the north than they lose to the south. So in general, species diversity increases the closer you get to the equator. You know, with the equator being just wildly crazy in terms of the number of species of odonats that would be down there. So as we get farther away, that diversity decreases, and you can actually see it right between the two states. In Wisconsin, for damselflies, we have three families of damselflies. They're the broadwing damsels, the pond damsels, and the spreadwings. The broadwings group are typically found at very highly oxygenated water. So trout streams, you know, places where there's just a lot of oxygenation going on. These are all the brightest colored damselflies that we have in Wisconsin. And they also have, you know, as the name suggests, proportionally much larger wings than the other two families. So they have really bright bodies, really bright wings. This is one example. Remember loving to see these guys when I was a little kid. This is a male river jewel wing. There are two jewel wings in the state. The males of both have these beautiful metallic green bodies. This one has a black dipped in ink, black tip to its wings, and the other one has a broader wing that's solid dark, you know, solid black. We also have two species of ruby spots in Wisconsin. One of them only found in the counties right down by Illinois. This is the more common one. This is a female American ruby spot. Again, very shiny metallic bodies and just beautiful coloration of the wings. The pond damselflies are the biggest group of damsels. They have relatively narrow, clear wings. Most of these are still water species, but there are exceptions to every rule. But I would say 70% are associated with still water, and maybe 25 to 30% moving water, or more general in both. In Wisconsin, we have one species of purple damselfly. And so needless to say, it's always a treat to see this one. This is a variable dancer. Sorry that that's sitting right on top of that label. But this is the male, and he's, like I said, just a gorgeous purple. We have a bunch of black and blue damselflies in the pond damsel group, and we call these bluets. They're part of the Enelagma genus. And I think there's 17 of them, and they basically come in three color forms. This is what we would term to be a blue bluet, where this part of the abdomen is more blue than black. About 70-30%, 70-30. And then and that one was a boreal bluet. And then we have intermediate bluets that are closer to half and half, actually just a little bit less than half blue. And this is a Thule bluet. It's a very widespread species throughout Wisconsin. And then we have ones that are mostly black. And I think there are 3 or 4 species. And so this is a skimming bluet. And just to make sure that you're confused, not all bluets are blue. This one's a Vesper bluet, and it literally lives up to its name. It only comes out right at dusk. It starts flying about half an hour before dark. Getting a picture of this guy getting this picture was a real high point in my photography career, because it took me 7 years before I had this opportunity. And then this little guy is a different genus. This is a forktail. This is absolutely the most common damselfly in Wisconsin. It's a generalist. It's found in almost every habitat. And it also has the longest flight season. The earliest I've ever seen this was on April 2nd of 2012. 2012 was a crazy warm year in the spring. It was 80 to 90 degrees in March for a week. And I literally had one of these flying on the 2nd of April. And I've also seen them flying all the way into November. So they basically fly all season long. So there are probably multiple generations going on across that time frame. And then finally, we have a family called the spreadwing damselflies. And I told you before that for the most part, damselflies perch with their wings directly over their back. And this is the group that's the exception. They basically, instead of perching with like this, they perch with their wings about like this, about 45-degree angles. And they're also the largest. The biggest one is about 2 inches long, which doesn't sound like much, but the biggest dragonfly is just over 3. This one is the longest, but it's also a real fragile looking one. It lives up to its name. It's the slender spreadwing, but you can see that 45-degree angle. This one has a little bit of has a white cell on the end of the wingtip, which actually is unique. So if you see that, you automatically know what species you're looking at. Here's a female of a different species. This is an emerald spreadwing. And then we have dragonflies. In North America, there are 7 families of dragonflies. To date, we haven't found one of those families in Wisconsin, but somebody thought they saw one last year. So this list may change, and that's on the hunt for this year, is to try to see if she really did. And she's pretty good. She knows what she's doing. So she probably did see it, and it does make some sense where she thought she saw it. So there is some hope that we will actually have all 7 families represented in Wisconsin. And the 7 are the darners, the clubtails. You can read that as well as I could say it. But the darners are some of the biggest and the most powerful flyers. The eyes meet at the center of the face and are just huge. And this is the group that would have compound eyes that could have as many as 30,000 eyelets in that structure. This one is the migrant, the most common migrant dragonfly. If you've ever seen a huge swarm of dragonflies flying in early September, most of them were probably this one. They're literally, people talk about seeing swarms of up to 1 million in some places. And they migrate just like the birds. And I've had the pleasure of watching that happen right over my property a few times. It was really interesting. The lowest level was a moving swarm of common green darners. And then above that were chimney swifts, and above that were nighthawks. It was just really cool to just watch this stream of different types of critters all heading south with the wind. We have quite a few members of the genus Aeshna in Wisconsin. This one's a really pretty one. This is a black-tipped darner, typically associated with the nymphal habitat would be a swampy area. Most of the Aeshna darners fly starting in June and all the way to September. This is a Aeshna, so it's not part of that genus, but this one flies right now. It's starting to emerge right now, and therefore that's how it gets its name of springtime darner. This is a subarctic darner. Basically, its nymphal habitat would be a sphagnum bog. And if you really ever want to have a really fun challenge, try getting those pictures. The flying dragonfly, there is one gentleman in Wisconsin who is absolutely spectacular. You know, he pulls it off just amazingly. But you know, trying to take a picture of a 3-inch animal with a telephoto lens that has a a focal distance of about 2 inches. That's, when it's trying to, it's an interesting experience. The next family we'll talk about are the clubtails. They get their name from the very tip of the abdomen. This is the craziest case in Wisconsin. This is a skillet clubtail, but most of them have a flared tip to their abdomen. This is also the one family where the eyes don't touch. All the rest at least touch in the center, and this one has a ridge instead that bridges that gap. But even in this case, they're not as widely separated as a damselfly set of eyes. This one is a cobra clubtail, also a pretty impressive club. These are found right here on the Wisconsin River. A different genus, this is a riffle snaketail. These like medium-sized, really clear, clean water streams, typically in the northern third of the state. This one was taken at Copper Falls State Park up by Mellon. You saw a picture of one of these before. This is the dragon hunter. This is the one that had taken that hummingbird to the ground. This to me always looks like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the dragonfly world. It's just muscle bound. I mean, his head looks like it's too small for his body. And that's just because there's that much power going on. He's got a huge, huge wingspan. And he lives up to his name. His favorite food are other dragonflies. And what he does is he sits on the ground and lets them fly over. And dragonfly eyes basically allow them to see in about 300 degrees. They can see, up, down, sides. About the only place they can't see is down there. So that's what he does. He sits on the ground, lets them fly over his head, comes up from that blind spot, and about the time that they realize he's there, they're dead. And I watched one of these catch another dragonfly that was about the same size. And they grab it and they take it to a branch. And basically then the next thing he does is decapitates it because they want to immobilize it. And it took him 3 bites to cut that other dragonfly's head off. A really cool little clubtail, not much of a club. This is a member of the Aragonthus genus, which are pond clubtails. So where most clubtails like moving water, this one actually is a still water species. This is a Stylurus clubtail, a hanging clubtail. These are the ones I talked about, how they start emerging typically at the end of June and go all the way into September or October. This one gets its name because right after it emerges, it flies straight up to the treetops and it stays up there. And only when it's time to mate does it come down, and it'll go out over the middle of a pretty fast moving river, large river. And then the females go out there and join it. Once they've mated, she'll just skip the tip of her abdomen along the surface and wash the eggs off into riffle areas. And then when they're done, they fly right back up into the treetops. So it is really tough to get a chance to take a picture of a mature adult of this species. So again, this was quite the treat. My daughter-in-law is a entomologist, and as part of her master's program, she had to get a bug collection and submit it for one of her classes. And she came home when I was working with 2 of the Wisconsin's premier odonata scientists. And we went out on the Mississippi River to look for something. And we did something that one of them dubbed extreme odonating, which is you get in a flat bottom boat, put somebody in the front with a net, and you basically chase these guys down at 20 some miles an hour. And so she was able to catch one, and she included it in her collection. And the professor was going through all these collections and, oh, that's nice, that's nice, that's nice. And he got to hers and he just stopped. How did you get that? And she says, oh, I got the video. You gotta see this. Another one with similar habits. Third family are the spiketails. These guys are another family of really big dragonflies. In this case, their eyes just meet. Most of them are kind of a dark chocolate brown, black with yellow spots. And they like really tiny streams, even seeps. This one is absolutely gorgeous. This is the arrowhead spiketail. And you can see where it gets its name. This is a twin spotted spiketail, and you can see where the family gets its name, because this is a female. And this is her ovipositor here. It looks like a spike on the tip of her abdomen, and she uses that to poke her eggs into the mud at the side of a small stream. Cruisers are another big variety. A couple of them are dark and one is brown. The dark ones have beautiful green eyes. They only have a single stripe on the thorax as a group. All the rest of them have two or more. And these guys also typically like larger streams. One of them will also be in real windswept lakes. So this is an Illinois river cruiser. And then this is a stream cruiser. They also have a neat thing where they have a light stripe across their face. These are the next group is the emeralds. They get their name from the color of the mature male's eyes. Beautiful, emerald green. Most of them are mid-sized. These are a really interesting dichotomy. There's 4 genuses, I think, right off the top of my head, or 5 in Wisconsin. One of them are the basketails, and those are some of the most common dragonflies we have in the state. One of the other genuses is the somatochlora, the striped emeralds, and those are the most rare, including our only federally endangered dragonfly. So aptly called, this one's the common basketail. It's the most common of the common. This is a forsypate emerald, one of those somatochlora, not quite as rare as the super rare one. And then this is the super rare one. This is a Hines emerald. It's federally endangered. This is the one I was talking about where its nymphs literally have to be in an environment where there's a limestone layer, moving water in the substrate, and then a specific species of crayfish, and they coexist in those burrows to overwinter. And I believe the nymphs of this species take 3 years to develop. And then finally, last group, I promised, the skimmers. And these are, most of them prefer still, slow moving water. And these are typically the most colorful dragonflies that we have in the state. And the most spectacular of all, in my opinion, is this one. This is a female Halloween pennant. And they love to just sit, out in a field up on a stalk like that, and their wings just kind of flutter. And just a really spectacular little animal. These guys are just starting to emerge. The white faces as a group are spring emergence. These are frosted white faces. And what you see here, those look like they might be eggs, but in fact, those are water mites. And it's a parasite that adheres to the exoskeleton of the adult. They actually are on the nymph before it emerges. And during the emergence process, they move from the nymph exoskeleton to the newly emerged dragonfly. And then when they're done and ready to go on to the next stage of their life, they just drop off into the water. So when the female or the male returns to the water to mate and lay eggs, that's when the mites fall off.
Dan?
Yeah.
Is that mite specific to dragonflies only?
Well, there are a lot of species of mites.
Yeah.
So this species is one of the species whose life cycle is tied to dragonflies. Yeah. This is another one of those species. I showed you one that got that layer of prunicity, the wax coating, as it got mature. This is a one in the same genus. It's doing the same thing. So this is a male, and with maturity, it developed all of these white spots. It's called a 12-spotted skimmer, and they're counting just the black ones because both the males and the females have the black spots. And just a mature male will have the white spots. And then it also gets this powder blue coating on its abdomen as well. This is another migrant. This one also overwintered, its progeny, they're just coming into the state right now. They started to appear last week, and they also would have come from the Gulf states. This little guy is also a migrant. He's only about that big. He's an inch and a quarter, almost an inch and a half from tip of the nose to the tip of the tail. And basically comes that same distance. And the common green darners appear first, and usually these will appear like 3 or 4 days behind. So they're not very, even though they're only half the size, they're covering that same ground almost as fast. And then this one is aptly named. This is the autumn meadowhawk, and this is the very last dragonfly that we'll see each year. First starts flying in early July, late June, but the latest I think I've ever seen this is November 18th or 19th. So if you have this last November, even though there were frosts in October, they survived that. And as long as it doesn't get below like about 26, 25 degrees, they can survive a light frost. They'll find a little pocket where they can stay warm and survive. And last year, I think they flew to about the 10th of November. If you want to become a bug nerd, how do you go about it? How do you find them, or how do you find out information? Well, first and foremost, there's lots of, one of the neat things that's happened over the last 20 years is we now have field guides. There's also a lot of internet discussion groups, websites. The Wisconsin Odonata survey that I was talking about is a survey location where you could submit records. But we also have the Wisconsin Dragonfly Society. We have a Facebook group. People are constantly sharing sightings that they may not be able to identify. We'll help them out. And then there are regional experts. And of course, just getting out there and having fun is the best way. These are some of the best field guides, if you will. This book was last updated in 2013. I spent the last 3 months working on it, got the permission of the author to update it. This is the draft from about 2 weeks ago. Literally 2/3 of the photos in here are changed. All of the range maps are updated. So this one is probably the best dragonfly guide for the state of Wisconsin because it's uniquely aimed at Wisconsin. And it's got range maps that show you where every species has been found to date. And I updated the 2 of those maps today. They're that current.
Where's that one located?
Typically can buy that from the UW Arboretum bookstore in Madison.
Who's the author?
Carl Legler, Carl and Dorothy Legler. He's also a fabulous expert on butterflies. If you really get bitten by the bug, like me, there are surveys where we love to have help from citizen scientists. Wisconsin Odonata Survey is one of those surveys. Odonata Central is a survey that covers the entire Western Hemisphere. And then the Dragonfly Society, we have our site. We have information out there about what we're doing as an organization. For insects in general, I must have said something. If you ever find an insect that you really would like to identify and you can't find anybody who can, post it here on bugguide.net. It's a spectacular site. There are entomologists from all over the North America that I swear they feel like it's some sort of a competition because I've literally posted pictures there and had identifications in as little as 5 minutes. It doesn't always happen that fast, but sometimes it does. It's crazy. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Dan, wow, very great presentation. Lots of good information. I noticed on a lot of the dragonflies and damselflies, there's that the stigma on the wings. What's that all about? Those dark spots on the wings?
It's actually, everything I've read, we believe it's a counterweight. Basically, it's a heavier cell in the front of the wing, and its design is to eliminate vibration. Because otherwise, without that, the wings could just get into a state of just and it's basically a dampening system, so the wings don't go out of control. Yes, sir.
I'm fascinated by the eyes of dragonflies. And as I understand it, what you call, let's see, eyelets, I thought they were called ommatidia.
Okay, I apologize. That's I'm a citizen scientist, so then.
No, that's okay.
So now you're going down my.
But I was just wondering, each individual, you mentioned 30,000 islets.
In some of the darners, they have over 30,000.
That is incredible.
Yes.
And my understanding is each one has its own neuron to the brain. Isn't that amazing? Because humans have one optic nerve to the brain from this eye and one from that eye. 30,000 separate going to the brain is just amazing to
Well,
me.
and think about something else. I mean, it took man until just about 20 years ago to develop a missile system that was capable of seeing a target and figuring out how to intercept it and hit it in flight. They do that all by themselves. And they're totally capable. They do not miss. So they for such a primitive animal that, basically is unchanged for 100 million years, all of that's built in. And, they can literally have something fly by and people played games with them. They'll like shoot peas past them. And the very first time the dragonfly starts to lurch and stops. And the third time, he didn't even move. So they're able to figure out, and it's faster than we could even respond. They've already figured out that's not even, that's not something I care about. But if it is, they automatically just figure out the vectors they need to just, meet it in air. And so it's.
One last question about the eyes. Is the general shape of these a hexagon or an octagon, or are they circular?
I don't believe it's circular. I believe it's.
I think it's either a hexagon or an octagon.
I'm not sure which, but yeah, it's definitely, there are straight edges in there. And they also have 3 ocelli between those that are also light gathering in a different way. But like I said, also, we have 3 different types of light sensor receptacles in our eye structure. They have 12. So, like I said, they're they're seeing ultraviolet, they're seeing, but they're seeing things we just don't understand. They can probably fly over water and understand if there's, some of these species don't ever want to lay their eggs in ponds with fish because their nymphs are too active and they get consumed. So they need to be able to detect whether there's fish in there. Well, they can do it by flying over the pond and they just move on.
And they have among the best vision of any insects, isn't that right?
Yep, absolutely.
For those that migrate, do they know how they navigate? Is it similar to birds?
We haven't figured that. I don't think anybody's, they're starting to get to the point. I think I heard that they're getting devices small enough now that I thought I heard that they had attached them to darners recently. But I was involved in a program. We were trying to figure out, they were trying to figure out where they come from and how long it takes them to move. So the best solution they could come up with was to do hydrogen isotope analysis of their wings, because the hydrogen isotopes where they emerge are embedded in the wing structure in that exoskeleton as they emerge. So they had people, volunteers catching them at various places, trying to figure out where that population came from. And then they could kind of extrapolate. We think they left about this time. It took, this one was caught 1,000 miles away. 10 days later, we know they're moving about 100 miles a day. So that's the type, at this point, that's the level of understanding that we have. But there are species of damselflies. One of them is this big that will all of a sudden appear hundreds of miles away from known populations. So and they've been actually caught in air balloons and things like that. They're up there thousands of feet up in the air column, and they're moving.
And so if they are up that high, Do they come down to feed while they're migrating?
Again, that's a question that, we can't, nobody, I mean, we just know they're up there.
I mean, I
So,
just wonder how
but-
much energy they need to
Yeah.
save up in order to.
Exactly, but like I said, some of these dragonfly, well, I have one species that I was the first one to ever find in both Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's called a striped saddlebags. Its normal range is from northern Argentina to northern Mexico. And I have found them now 25 times in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So every once in a while they become wrong way Charlies and go the wrong direction or get a little carried away and go too far. So I mean, so the nearest population is Mexico that we know of, that where they actually successfully produce young. So.
I imagine you have a life list.
Oh, yeah.
How many have you seen and how many have you captured by camera?
Wisconsin, there's 165 species. I have now found 158.
In how many years?
I started in 2009. And a few of those that I haven't been able to find have only been seen in the state one time or two times. So it's not for a lack of trying. Every once in a while you get stupidly lucky though. I was out yesterday and found one that has only been found in Wisconsin 21 times. So that was a.
Dan, there's a talk among birders that the evolutionary succession of a birder is to move from that into dragonflies. Is this true?
Well, yeah, but the question is, are you going up or are you going down?
No judgment there.
Thank you. In my case, I was a really avid birder and I decided I needed to take pictures of what so I started digiscoping. And for those of you who have tried that, you know that that's a really painful way to get a picture. You take your 20-power spotting scope and you put a little itty bitty digital camera up and use the scope as your telephoto lens. And if it works, it's spectacular. It doesn't work very often. So eventually I convinced my wife to let me buy a digital SLR camera with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And then in the middle of the summer, all the birds are nesting and there's nothing to take pictures of, or it's the same bird over and over and over again. So then you start looking for new things. And I found dragonflies and butterflies. And of course, being a good birder, I had to identify what I found. So then I found the Wisconsin Odonata survey. And luckily the guy that runs that survey, who's now retired, Bob Dubois, he is quite the mentor. He's very gentle if you screw things up. And I screwed up a lot, but he got me there. He got me over that hump. Like I said, I started in 2009, just to show you how badly I fell off the deep end. As of the end of the season last year, I had submitted 19,000 sighting records to that survey.
And you said you had a wife?
Very understanding of one, yes.
We have just two questions that are up there on the screen. What's the biggest dragonfly?
In Wisconsin, the longest dragonfly is the Royal River Cruiser. I think it's 3.2 inches long and about a 7.5 inch. Found on the lower stretch of the Mississippi River. Up until about 10 years ago, it was only known to be as far north as Grant County, and I've now extended its known range just north of La Crosse. Yeah, good question. What are we going to do with? Yeah, unfortunately, the best biological supply company forever was a company called BioQuip, and they just went out of business in March. And luckily I heard about it in time. I bought a whole bunch of net bags for my nets, but I have not found a really good replacement for that. But there are nets out there on extendable nets, just not the same quality that I've been able to find. So that's still definitely a big question. Where are we going to find that kind of class of equipment? So, other crazy questions for a crazy Norwegian bug chaser?
I don't want to monopolize, but you say that most of the mating that happens is the females choose the best habitat and we get the male that comes along with it. Is that correct?
It's a good part of it, but it could also just be an accident if the female flies, when the female flies into the water area, if a male sees it, he's gonna take off like a rocket, and so will every other male. It's, you know, but she's gonna have some chance to try to make that selection, but it's not always up to her.
I was also wondering then, why so colorful if it's not really about sexual selection, if it's more about females selecting the habitat?
I'm wondering if it's more about the territorial interactions between the males. You know, a really mature male, especially the skimmers that develop prunosity, you know, the more prunos, the more sexually mature that male would be. But again, I'm not sure that I could base that on stuff that I've read, so I'd have to double check on that. I'm not sure about. Yes, sir.
That brings up two completely separate things. One, at our cottage, pretty much every summer we'll see we got two docks 30 feet apart or something like that, and a dragonfly will come, you know, just keep going back and forth between those two docks. And I've seen it chase off others.
Yeah, so that's a territorial male. Different males of different species have different size territories. Some it can be 200 yards. Some it's a very short back and forth over 15 or 20 feet. Some of them it's moving around over the open water. They'll come and perch on your dock, and then when they're ready to go out and patrol, they'll be out actually over the open area in the middle.
But that's territorial for hunting. That's not a mating kind of thing.
That's waiting for a mate.
It is a mating territorial.
Typically, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
I wasn't sure. And the other thing is a story and then a question that relates to it. A number of years ago, I had a cottage, a cabin that was close to Lake Michigan, a lot of sand. And one day, in the years I lived there, one day I went outside and the backyard was just full of dragonflies. They're all the same kind. They're flying all over the place. And it was like being in a movie or something. It was very strange. And they were all over, and I didn't understand why. And then I noticed that the flying ants had hatched. And you had mentioned that they sometimes travel in flocks, or whatever you call a dragonfly flock.
Quite a bunch of species, a lot of the emeralds and a lot of the darners will get together in feeding swarms. And sometimes it's a mixed swarm where you'll see multiple, some of them are identifiable, at least that they're different sizes, especially emeralds. You can actually see multiple species flying in a swarm. And so they're swarming to feed.
Okay. I wasn't sure if they were migrating or.
If you saw those.
It seemed like because the flying ants were there, that it had to be related to that.
But the flying ants are typically a September thing. So this was probably a migrating flock that had found that food supply. So it's both. You know,
It only happened once. I've only seen it happen once in that.
yeah, but I'm saying it's, you know, when those migrating flock swarms, I guess, I apologize, would find a food source like that, you know, their activity is going to attract others. One of the more exciting situations like that, I went out, walked up by my shed and realized there was an area about, you know, 30 feet by 15 feet where there were literally hundreds of common green darners flying. And I think this is exactly, they were chasing flying ants. And I just, for kicks and giggles, I couldn't track any of them. So I just swung my net. And I think I caught 4 of them in one swing. I mean, but you could literally hear them hitting each other, knocking the wings. There were that many of them in this small space.
Yeah, I was just surrounded by, I tried touching them, but I couldn't, you know, they stayed away. I couldn't touch one. But yeah, I've seen that in the past growing up. When you see if I saw nightingales, I immediately looked for flying ants because I would never see nightingales except when the flying ants were coming out.
Yep. Yeah, and the migrating.
Not nightingales, nighthawks.
Nighthawks. I knew what you
I knew what
Nighthawks.
On the same topic of territoriality, not only with lakes and ponds, but stretches of stream, I've heard that a male will have a territory.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
And let's say it's a hot summer day and the female wants to get some water, and she needs to mate with the male in order for her to be allowed down to the water and get a drink.
And that territory varies widely in terms of how big it is and how the male patrols it. If once you get used to it, you can actually identify the species in some cases just by how it's flying that territory.
Would be like 15 to 30 yards, or
Some of those cruisers, the river cruisers, it could be a couple hundred yards.
Oh, wow.
It's a really long.
It's a big territory.
Yeah, yep. Somebody was asking most exciting find. Probably the striped saddlebags. It's like I said, I found the very first one ever seen in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. So that was a big one. But then also last summer, I took a couple people on a field trip into Jackson County and I wore them out a little bit. They were sitting in the car and I went into a little pond and I quickly came back and said, I think you need to get in here because I think you're going to find this worth your while. And we walked in and we found painted skimmers. And you know, this year they've been seen 7 times already, but up until that was only the 7th sighting for the state. So that was another pretty wild one. Getting a dragonfly out of the net. Basically what you want to do is you want to reach in and you want to get all 4 wings. And that's really important. You want to hold them by the wings, but don't start pulling on them until you check to see if the dragonfly has grabbed the net with his mouth. Because if it has, it's not going to be good. So you want to just let them tease it. But yeah, you get all 4 wings and hold all 4 wings together directly over its body. That's a very safe way to hold a dragonfly. Their wings are that strong. An exception to that would be a teneral. If you see a dragonfly that you think is or damselfly that you think is a teneral, don't net it, don't touch it. Their exoskeleton is so soft that you could destroy it by handling it. But again, that's soft, milky looking animal. So they're pretty identifiable. It's pretty easy to see them once you have any experience at all. You know what you're looking at. Netting technique depends on your target. Some of the fastest and most difficult to net are some of the big stream cruisers. But if you watch and what you want to do is sit and watch them and figure out, hopefully they have a pattern in what they're doing. And when you do swing a net, you want to swing from below and behind, again, taking advantage of that dragon hunter technique where you attack them from their blind spot. And you have to swing hopefully twice as fast as they're flying. You want to go much faster and you have to keep swinging as, way past the point where you think they're in the net. And then you flip the net, turn the net handle and flip that net bag over the rim before you stop that net from going full speed. If you don't do that, they will be out of that net before it stops. As soon as it slows down below their airspeed, they're out. So they're that fast. Yeah, so basically trying to swing from below and behind. If I've got something that's flying along a stream, I'll put my net like behind a little clump of grass so that they don't see it. And, but if you're having to reach 4 or 5 feet to catch up to the dragonfly, your chance of catching it is approaching 0. They're going to be able to move faster than you can and react and change direction faster. Like one of the best, I was talking about that extreme odonating where we were going in a boat. At one point I had my daughter-in-law, my son, my other son, and myself. All 3 of them had a net and a pair in tandem in wheel came. So the female's not flying, the male's carrying her, came right down the center of the boat. All 3 of them swung at that pair and none of them caught it. And it was hilarious because I was watching the whole thing and I'd see the first net go and it just went and bobbed just far enough to go around that and flew right over the next person's head. The second did it, and it flew past my ear about 2 inches. And it just, it was effortlessly. I mean, it's just like, I think Kurt Mead in his book describes dragonfly netting as a potential spectator sport because it can be so hilarious. Yeah, he knows what he's talking about.
It is fascinating.
And we thought we were cool.
You just aren't nerdy enough. You gotta be, you gotta embrace being a nerd.
Oh, yeah.
I embrace being a nerd. If you're gonna be a geek, be the alpha geek.
That was outstanding.